Good afternoon. Great to be here. Uh, Nice to share some time talking about a subject that I know we all love and enjoy. And I have a few things I'd like to say today, and want to try to stimulate some thinking and perhaps a broader direction than maybe most of you have been doing. So bear with me, and we will go through some very interesting points. Now, suppose you saw a sign in front of a parking space that said, "Reserved for green vehicles." Your pickup truck, I live in Texas, so we have pickup trucks, has a green paint job. Could you park there? Would you? And suppose you did. A cop comes along and sees your truck. Should they issue a citation for a parking violation? And suppose they did, and the case goes to court. Should the judge rule for or against your case? Now, I'm not a lawyer, but common sense suggests you almost certainly violated the intent of the rule posted on the sign. Now, maybe licensed drivers can be expected to correctly interpret parking signs, but in business, how many of your end customers and workers are licensed to do what they do? How well prepared are they in many cases? So let me make several important points, which I believe are highly relevant to the issues we face today. First of all, messaging matters. If sign makers mess up in communicating guidance, business activity can and will go astray. Secondly, good messaging achieves true intent. It's not enough to simply establish policies, regulations, and authoritative knowledge. True intent must be properly interpreted and well communicated. Now, I know most of you are data professionals, or at least I assume that's the case. So, why am I talking to you about signs? And the reason is because I believe data too is a message, and you too are sign makers. In the knowledge age, messaging is simply not to be ignored, and it's ever more true in a faceless digital world. Now, let's be clear what aspects of messaging I'm talking about here. First is selection of the term. Now, clearly, the term green vehicle could be ambiguous. Did the business people foresee that? Should they have thought through its usage and constrained communication channels, like the limited space on that sign, more thoroughly? Shouldn't Texans, shouldn't professionals have given them a heads up about potential interpretation problems in advance? Definition of the concept. What is the meaning of green vehicle? Is the concept defined clearly? Is it defined somewhere that is accessible for people who need it? For example, the driver of the truck? Let's assume the driver of the truck is a righteous citizen. Could they find the definition in real time? Maybe post it on the back of the sign, or maybe there's an app for that. And knowing the rules, if you unravel this ball of yarn completely, eventually you get to the longhand expression of the parking law or regulation in an authoritative source. In other words, you get to rules, and those are the ultimate source of truth. Without ever referring to that source directly, it's hardly surprising you'd go astray in operationalizing guidance. Yet in today's practices, including data design, that happens all the time. And by the way, commenting on the previous presentation, the concept of marriage, the question is really compliance. Do you need to know about marriage? Is it within the scope? Are there rules that require you to know about it? That would be how I would answer that question in terms of, do we care about the event marriage? In the knowledge age, the central issue is effective communication. And I believe it's time we architect how we express business knowledge on a much larger scale. And the foundation to do that is a structured business vocabulary. It's what we call a concept model. Now, remember, there's no inherent meaning in signs or words or data. Meaning is all in people's minds. If you want to communicate meaning, it's all about the messages. It's all about the language that you're using. In fact, language is the original source for data. Now, maybe you're thinking this stuff is not your concern. Uh, you're wrong. The result of such thinking is data and systems that don't message properly, ones that never seem consistent or coherent. They're simply not plugged properly into business knowledge. Now ask yourself, who are the real agents of change in organizations these days? Well, by and large, it's you. Now, this is a rapid fire presentation, so I'll shift gears here, but I'll come back to that in just a bit. A client recently posed the following questions to us. Should the business owner of a business term and the owner of the related data pertaining to that term be one and the same? Are the responsibilities inseparable? Should they be and can they be distinguished? Now, I've listened to many presentations and read a great many articles about data governance, but I have never come across anyone saying that ownership of vocabulary and data can and should be separated. Have you? My answer is, of course they can be separated. As proof, consider this. Let's suppose you're a strong or even moderate believer in data privacy. You think the consumer or the citizen should own or control their personal data, not the organization that they interact with. To me, it's nonetheless pretty obvious that the organization does not need to, and in fact cannot cede control of terms and definitions for those concepts to the consumer. The result would be simply anarchy. Clearly, the ownership of business vocabulary can be separate from the ownership of data. Now, what about cases that do not involve questions of data privacy? Do the responsibilities need to be separate? Again, yes, lack of separation, I believe, is the root cause of a host of problems, not the least of which is massive loss of productivity right across the organization. So let's take a hard look at the respective responsibilities of ownership for vocabulary versus ownership for data. First, what about ownership for vocabulary? Meaning terms and definitions. Well, that implies exercise of high level authority. Well crafted business definitions seldom change, but when they do, broad implications for the business can result. For example, consider the potential implications of changing the definition of product. Such a change should be viewed as a matter of business policy and or deep subject matter expertise. The impact can be far greater than on just data. All other forms of business knowledge messaging can be impacted as well. I'll say more about that in a minute as well. What about ownership of data? Well, in contrast, it implies performance of operational responsibility, not executive level authority. Now, let's take a closer look at that. Of course, many of you are quite familiar with the day to day activities of data governance. Adjustments to data specifications are generally ongoing. Business rules for consistency and correctness need continual adjustment and reevaluation, especially as special cases and exceptions and new channels arise. Code schemes need to be managed and mapping regimens need to be regulated. Yes, lack of proper attention to these matters can have significant impact, for example, in the production of analytics, but immediate results are usually localized. In other words, for specific transactions that are in error. Honestly, those are really not executive level concerns. So, who then makes the ideal owner of a business term and its related definition? Before I answer, let's be clear, I'm not talking about how a term and definition should be sourced. Adoption of pre-existing outside terms and definitions is often a great idea, at least as starting points. And there are great outside sources for vocabularies in many industry areas that we can and should adopt wherever possible. Never invent if you can adopt. But in any case, the business owner of the term and definition can decide about adoption of terms and definitions. So here then are our criteria for vocabulary ownership, more or less in the given order of priority. First in priority, the business unit that creates the concept. That business unit is usually responsible for governance or enabling functions rather than line functions. Frequently, the unit has produced authoritative policy documents that can serve as key reference points. In financial investment, for example, a policy document addressing delegation of authority might introduce the concepts of allocated capital versus committed capital. The business unit responsible for producing that policy document should be the owner of those terms. Second in priority, the business unit that has the broadest knowledge of the concept and use of the designated term. Now, we all know that business units often create concepts and terms for their own needs, even when those same concepts are more widely applicable across the organization. But the owner should be the business unit that has the deepest understanding and widest view of the concept. Thirdly, in priority, the business unit most impacted if the meaning of the term changes. And then fourthly, the business unit most upstream in the value chain. That would generally be the one where data is first created under the term. Now, let me make another important point here, and that is that ownership of vocabulary is not the same as management of vocabulary. Ownership means having authority over a term and definition, literally the authority to mandate the meaning of a concept. Management of vocabulary, in contrast, means having functional responsibility for vocabulary-related tasks. Such tasks might include things like facilitation and outreach programs, assistance with disambiguation of existing source materials, coordination with external standard bodies, providing index and search facilities for business data, support for authoring, and so on and so forth. Now, some would argue that vocabulary management should be part of a more general knowledge management, KM function within the organization. But I'm not so sure about that. My experience may be different from yours with knowledge management is it's more reactive than proactive and often focused more on deep domain expertise rather than business operations. But yes, vocabulary is definitely part of knowledge. It's a fundamental part of knowledge. Vocabulary management in the form I'm talking about, I think, is something new, and it's part of a broader organizational adjustment toward being more knowledge oriented, which I think is entirely appropriate in this century. Now, if you wanted to be trendy about it, I guess you could call it knowledge management 2.0 or something, but that doesn't exactly fit. The issue isn't about managing knowledge per se, rather, it's about coordinating messaging about the knowledge. Now, does that touch on data? Well, of course it does. And I've tried to explain some of that. So why don't we call it data governance 2.0? Well, because it's almost definitely not about governing data per se. Yes, data professionals are at its mercy, especially when they have no blueprint, but the knowledge messaging problem is much broader than simply data. Well, whatever we call this new functional responsibility, I do know one thing for sure. At this critical point in the knowledge age, it's something every organization should be working toward. Now, we recently coordinated the development of an enterprise-wide concept model, think structured business vocabulary, for a large financial organization. It included over 1,700 business terms and business definitions, along with 65 graphic diagrams, what we call neighborhoods, showing visually how the underlying concepts relate. Well, what was the organization's motivation? Well, it's the creation of a sophisticated and very expensive new data lake for the business. They understood clearly, and give them credit for that, that an integrated and useful solution would never be achievable for that data lake without a common integrated business vocabulary. That's such a basic reality. I don't know how we lose sight of it. For us, the project highlighted where business vocabulary actually originates in the organization and those who need to be involved in its standardization. After feeling our way forward, we zeroed in on the company's policy documents, which had official glossaries. Of course, each document had its own glossary, and none of those took a completely enterprise view, but those are problems we could recognize and address. What better starting point for terms and definitions than business policy documents? When you work on vocabulary as a true business problem, you see how ineffective any project centric or IT up or data out approach is really likely to prove. Now, in business, policy documents lie at the very foundation of business knowledge messaging. Why? Because they deal with strategy. But by no means is business knowledge messaging limited to just policy documents. Business knowledge messaging in your organization can be viewed as a multi layered stack, which we call the business knowledge messaging stack. Business vocabulary and natural language are a central component at each layer in that stack. You'll find that words and sentences, in other words, messages, are literally everywhere in the business. What I'm saying to you is that signs are everywhere in your business, and they start way before you ever get to data. There's a whole array of sign makers and stack writers on the business side out there who need the very same thing that data professionals need. And what that is a blueprint. Now, with that in mind, where does the blame lie for messed up data? Well, we often blame organizations' silos and IT methodologies, but there's plenty of blame to go all around. Think how disorganized and disintegrated most companies' business knowledge messaging stacks really are. From a sign point of view, that's where knowledge actually originates. So maybe in part, it's not completely our fault that our data is so messed up. On the other hand, in the digital world, we are the change agents. So, who's going to get things on a better footing in your organization as a whole, if not you? So, ask yourself, where is a business knowledge blueprint for everyone to work by, including all the sign makers on the business side, those stack writers that write those kinds of documents, as well as data professionals working with structured data? Well, what you need is a comprehensive structured business vocabulary, a concept model. Where is it in most organizations? Why don't we have that blueprint already? Now, I'm not saying that creating one of those is easy, but I'm also not saying it takes an impossibly long time. We're talking months, not years. And we've proven that. And it's a very important message for your organization to take hold of in the knowledge age. How can you create your knowledge blueprint? My two most recent books talk about that, and we offer comprehensive training to show you. Now, do notice in this, as an aside, that there is a common theme in the title of my most two recent books, and that's no accident. And yes, they are a series. And yes, they really are about knowledge, even though focused on vocabulary. I believe data professionals, I'm talking about us here attending, need to step up to this broader and more fundamental challenge. I don't think there's really any choice in the knowledge age. I think we need a new vision and a new roadmap for longer term success. We need a new mindset. It's the only way we'll ever fix root problems and seize the opportunities ahead of us. Remember, it's all about sign making in all of its forms. And in today's world, all of us are the sign makers. Okay, that's my message to you today. I hope you'll connect with me on social media, Google my new books, or have a look at them on Amazon. And thank you very much for sharing this time with me today.